Between 1973 and 1986, a single offender terrorized California for more than a decade. During that time, at least 51 women were raped, 13 people were murdered, and more than 100 homes were violated. The attacks spanned multiple cities, crossed jurisdictions, and evolved in method. For years, investigators believed they were hunting different criminals. They were wrong. Statistically, serial offenders who remain unidentified for more than 10 years are rare. Even rarer are those who operate across regions, alter their methods, and successfully evade capture into old age. Yet the man later known as the Golden State Killer did exactly that. He stopped killing. He blended in. He aged. And for more than 40 years, he lived as if his crimes belonged to another lifetime. These horrifying stories are more than just cold headlines on the front page. They represent the limits of traditional investigation and the long shadows cast over victims whose cases never reached court. To follow each file as it unfolds, subscribe now and stay alert. Because in true crime, time does not erase truth. It only delays it. The Golden State Killer was not always known by that name. In the early 1970s, residents of Visalia, California, were plagued by a burglar called the Visalia Ransacker. Homes were entered quietly. Furniture was overturned. Women's underwear was scattered. Pets were killed. Valuable items were often left behind, while small, personal objects were taken. Over roughly 20 months, more than 100 burglaries were linked to the same offender. At the time, the crime seemed invasive but survivable. Then the violence escalated. By 1976, attacks in Sacramento and surrounding communities revealed a different pattern. The offender became known as the East Area Rapist. He stalked neighborhoods. He conducted surveillance. He called victims in advance. He entered homes armed and methodical, targeting women and later couples. Control was central to his crimes. Fear was deliberate. Between 1979 and 1986, the offender changed again. Murders began to appear in Southern California. Couples were attacked in their homes. Victims were beaten or shot. Sexual assault preceded death. The cases were attributed to the original Night Stalker. For decades, no one realized the rapist in Northern California and the killer in the South were the same man. By the time DNA technology matured enough to link the crimes in 2001, the trail had gone cold. Suspects were investigated and eliminated. Leads dried up. The killer had vanished into ordinary life. He married. He worked. He raised children. And he was never arrested. What finally ended his anonymity was not a confession or a witness. It was science. Specifically, genealogical DNA testing, aided by modern computational analysis, allowed investigators to identify distant relatives and reconstruct family trees reaching back into the 19th century. From that data, one name emerged: Joseph James DeAngelo. In April 2018, after decades of silence, he was arrested. In 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. This is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the story of how numbers, data, and persistence finally caught up with a man who believed he had outrun history. Before California knew him as a rapist or a killer, Joseph James DeAngelo was something else entirely. He was a prowler, a burglar, a presence felt more than seen. Between 1973 and 1975, residents of Visalia, a small agricultural city in central California, began reporting a string of unsettling home invasions. The offender did not take televisions or cash. He did not smash windows or force doors. Instead, he slipped inside quietly, leaving behind a sense of violation that lingered long after the intruder was gone. Police labeled him the Visalia ransacker. More than 100 burglaries were eventually attributed to the same individual. The pattern was distinctive. Drawers were pulled open. Personal items were disturbed. Women's underwear was scattered across bedrooms. Small objects were taken, while valuables were ignored. In several cases, family pets were found injured or killed. These acts were not random. They were deliberate. According to investigative reports, the ransacking appeared designed to send a message rather than acquire property. The offender demonstrated an intimate familiarity with the neighborhoods he targeted. He favored homes near parks, canals, or open fields, areas that provided escape routes. He struck at night, often while residents slept. In some cases, he returned to the same homes multiple times. The repetition suggested surveillance. The offender was learning, testing boundaries, refining control. In September 1975, the Visalia ransacker crossed a line that would redefine the threat he posed. Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, confronted a masked intruder who was attempting to abduct his daughter from their home. During the struggle, Snelling was shot and killed. The suspect escaped. For investigators, the implication was immediate and chilling. The burglar was now a murderer. Shortly after the killing, the ransacking stopped. At the time, police believed the offender had either fled the area or been apprehended for an unrelated crime. There was no evidence to suggest he had transformed. No indication that his behavior would escalate further. That assumption would later prove catastrophic. By 1976, a new pattern emerged hundreds of miles north, in the suburbs of Sacramento. Home invasions began again, but these were different. The offender now entered occupied homes while residents were awake. He was armed. He restrained victims using shoelaces and ligatures brought with him. He spoke. He threatened. And he raped. Investigators called him the East Area Rapist. Between 1976 and 1979, at least 51 sexual assaults were linked to the East Area Rapist. His methods were calculated. He conducted extensive surveillance before attacking, sometimes calling victims to learn their routines. He entered homes through sliding glass doors or unlocked windows. He stacked dishes on the backs of male victims and warned that any sound would result in death. The threat was not empty. The fear was absolute. The offender displayed a sophisticated understanding of police response times and investigative procedures. He moved between jurisdictions, complicating coordination between departments. He altered his appearance. He left misleading evidence. In several instances, he taunted law enforcement by calling police stations or victims after attacks. The calls were short, controlled, and deeply unsettling. Despite the scale of the crimes, investigators failed to identify the offender. Suspects were questioned and eliminated. Composite sketches circulated. Community meetings were held. Fear spread. Yet the attacks continued. Then, abruptly, they stopped. By late 1979, the East Area Rapist vanished. For years, no similar assaults were reported. Many believed the offender had been incarcerated or had died. Others speculated he had moved out of state. Few considered the possibility that he had changed again. In December 1979, a young couple, Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning, were found murdered in their Southern California home. The scene bore similarities to earlier rapes. The victims were bound. Sexual assault had occurred. The killer had struck at night and disappeared without a trace. Additional murders followed in the early 1980s. The offender became known as the original Night Stalker. At the time, these cases were investigated separately. The geographic distance and apparent differences in victim profiles obscured the connection. It would take more than 2 decades for DNA evidence to confirm what investigators had missed. The burglar, the rapist, and the killer were the same man. Joseph James DeAngelo did not disappear. He adapted. As the crimes escalated, so did his caution. He refined his techniques, minimized risk, and eventually stopped altogether. By the mid-1980s, the attacks ended. DeAngelo settled into a life that appeared unremarkable. He married, he raised children, he worked as a mechanic. Some recalled a temper. None suspected a predator. The evolution of his crimes reveals a pattern that investigators would later recognize as escalation rather than transformation. Each phase built upon the last. Control replaced curiosity. Violence replaced intrusion. And when the risk grew too great, he stopped. For decades, his victims waited without answers. Their cases sat dormant, connected only by fear and unanswered questions. It would take a new era of science to expose what decades of investigation could not. And that reckoning was still to come. When the East Area Rapist abruptly stopped attacking in Northern California, investigators were left with a troubling void. No suspect taken into custody. No death notice. At the time, law enforcement agencies interpreted the silence as relief. In December of 1979, more than 400 miles south, a married couple was found dead inside their home in Goleta, California. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning had been bound, beaten, and shot. The crime scene revealed signs of sexual assault. The attack had occurred at night. The offender entered quietly and left without a trace. To detectives in Santa Barbara County, the case appeared isolated. There was no immediate reason to connect it to the East Area Rapist. Jurisdictions were fragmented. Databases were limited. DNA analysis was still in its infancy. What investigators did not yet understand was that the offender had shifted again, not only in geography, but in intent. Over the next several years, similar murders occurred across Southern California. In Ventura County, a young couple was attacked. In Orange County, another woman was found sexually assaulted and killed inside her home. The victims were often couples. The homes were quiet, suburban, and familiar. The offender struck at night, bound his victims, and disappeared before morning. Law enforcement began referring to the unknown assailant as the original Night Stalker. The pattern was unmistakable once seen. The bindings matched those used by the East Area Rapist. The offender demonstrated the same methodical control. He restrained male victims first, often stacking objects on their backs to detect movement, then assaulted the women. In several cases, he killed both victims after the assault. The escalation was complete. From 1979 to 1986, at least 13 murders were attributed to the original Night Stalker. Among the most notable were the killing of Charlene and Lyman Smith in 1980 and the murder of Janelle Cruz in 1986. Cruz, a young woman living with her parents, was assaulted and killed after the offender waited inside her home. It would be his final known victim. Despite the similarities, the connection between the Northern California rapes and the Southern California murders was not formally established for decades. Investigators worked their cases independently, constrained by geography, technology, and institutional silos. Suspects were developed, questioned, and cleared. Each time the trail went cold. The offender's behavior suggested more than brutality. It suggested patience. He waited. He observed. He selected victims who fit his evolving criteria. He brought his own ligatures. He avoided leaving forensic evidence. In some cases, he cleaned himself inside the victims' homes. These were not impulsive acts. They were calculated. At the same time, Joseph James D'Angelo was living an ordinary life. Public records later showed that he had been employed as a police officer in Exeter, California, during the Visalia ransacker period. He lost that job after being caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. He then worked various mechanical and maintenance jobs. He married. He became a father. He attended family gatherings. To neighbors, he was quiet, occasionally irritable, but not remarkable. This dual existence was not accidental. D'Angelo's background provided him with an understanding of police procedure and investigative limits. He knew how evidence was collected. He knew how suspects were evaluated. He understood response times and patrol patterns. That knowledge allowed him to anticipate law enforcement behavior and avoid detection. By the mid-1980s, the murders stopped. There were no arrests, no confessions. For many, the case simply faded into history. The original Night Stalker became another unsolved chapter in California's violent past. In 2001, a breakthrough finally arrived. Advances in DNA testing allowed investigators to compare genetic material collected from multiple crime scenes. The results were conclusive. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same individual. The revelation reshaped the case, but it did not deliver a suspect. For the victims and their families, the confirmation brought both clarity and frustration. The scope of the offender's crimes was now undeniable. Yet the man responsible remained unnamed. The case entered a long period of stagnation. Detectives retired. Evidence was archived. Leads dried up. Decades passed. What no one knew was that the key to identifying the Golden State Killer had not been lost. It had simply not been invented yet. And when it finally arrived, it would change criminal investigation forever. By the early 2000s, the case of the Golden State Killer had entered a familiar and discouraging phase. Investigators knew more than ever before, yet they were no closer to an arrest. DNA evidence had finally linked the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker into a single offender. The scope of the crimes was now undeniable. But the identity of the man behind them remained hidden. Traditional investigative methods had reached their limits. Over the years, thousands of tips had been reviewed. Hundreds of suspects had been questioned. Many had been excluded through DNA testing. The remaining possibilities narrowed, then vanished. Detectives who had spent their careers chasing the offender retired. Evidence was boxed, cataloged, and stored. For the victims and their families, justice seemed permanently out of reach. What changed the trajectory of the case was not a confession, a witness, or a mistake by the killer. It was a shift in how identity itself could be reconstructed. In 2017, investigators turned to a relatively new approach known as forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA analysis, which compares a suspect's DNA directly to evidence from a crime scene, genealogical testing works outward. It searches for partial matches among distant relatives who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to public ancestry databases. The principle was simple but powerful. Even if a killer never provided his own DNA, someone related to him might have a cousin, a second cousin, a distant relative tracing family history. From those fragments, a family tree could be built. This approach had already shown promise in identifying unknown remains and resolving decades-old cases. Applying it to one of the most notorious serial offenders in American history, however, carried both technical and ethical challenges. The task of leading this effort fell to a team that included investigators and a specialist named Barbara Ray Venter. She was not a police officer. She was a genetic genealogist, skilled in reconstructing family lineages across generations using DNA data and historical records. The process was painstaking. DNA recovered from Golden State Killer crime scenes was uploaded to a public genealogy database under a law enforcement alias. Almost immediately, partial matches appeared. None were close relatives. There were no siblings, no children, only distant cousins, some separated by 5 or 6 generations. From there, the real work began. Using these distant matches, Ray Venter and her collaborators began building extensive family trees. They traced lines back to the 1800s, mapping marriages, births, migrations, and deaths. Each branch expanded outward, producing hundreds of names. Most were eliminated quickly. Wrong age, wrong location, wrong sex. Slowly, the list narrowed. What emerged was a family line that led to a man born in 1945. He had lived in California during the years of the crimes. He had military training. He had worked in law enforcement. And he had the physical characteristics consistent with eyewitness descriptions from decades earlier. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. Before making an arrest, investigators needed confirmation. Genealogical evidence alone was not sufficient for prosecution. They needed D'Angelo's DNA. Rather than confront him directly, law enforcement chose surveillance. They followed him quietly, documenting his routines. He lived an unremarkable life in a suburban neighborhood. He went grocery shopping. He worked on his motorcycle. He interacted with neighbors. Nothing about his behavior suggested urgency or fear. At one point, investigators retrieved a discarded tissue from his trash. Later, they collected DNA from the handle of his car. The samples were analyzed and compared to the crime scene evidence. The match was definitive. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was 72 years old. When officers approached him, he showed little resistance. According to reports, he appeared confused, even frail. The man who had once terrorized entire communities was taken into custody without incident. The arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the public alike. For decades, the Golden State Killer had been a faceless monster. Now he was an aging man in handcuffs. In the months that followed, prosecutors built their case carefully. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked D'Angelo to multiple murders and assaults. Survivors were given the opportunity to confront him in court. For many, it was the first time they had seen the man responsible for the trauma that shaped their lives. In June 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo entered a guilty plea to 13 counts of murder and admitted to dozens of other crimes. In exchange, the death penalty was taken off the table. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as victims spoke. Some expressed anger. Others relief. Many described a sense of closure they had never expected to experience. The case of the Golden State Killer became a landmark moment in criminal justice. Not only because a prolific offender was finally held accountable, but because it demonstrated the transformative power of science. Genealogical DNA, supported by modern computational analysis, had succeeded where decades of traditional investigation had failed. At the same time, the arrest raised important questions about privacy, about consent, about how far technology should reach into personal data in pursuit of justice. Those debates continue today. What remains undisputed is this: A man who believed he had outrun his past was ultimately undone by the very thing he could not control: biology. And with that, one of the longest-running manhunts in American history finally came to an end. When Joseph James DeAngelo stood in a California courtroom in 2020, the man before the judge bore little resemblance to the figure who had haunted the state decades earlier. He was elderly, frail, silent. Yet the weight of his crimes filled the room. For the victims and their families, this moment had been 40 years in the making. By pleading guilty to 13 counts of murder and admitting responsibility for dozens of additional crimes, DeAngelo avoided the death penalty. In return, he received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The legal outcome was decisive. The moral reckoning, however, was far more complex. For survivors of the East Area rapist, the courtroom became a place of confrontation and reclaiming power. Many spoke directly to DeAngelo, describing the long-term impact of the assaults. Careers altered, relationships damaged. Decades lived under the shadow of fear. Some expressed rage, others expressed relief. A few described something quieter, a sense that the past had finally been named. For families of murder victims, the proceedings offered a different kind of closure. Names long spoken only in police files were acknowledged in open court. Lives that had ended violently were restored, if only symbolically, to the center of the story. The focus shifted, at last, from the predator to those he harmed. Beyond the courtroom, the case reshaped criminal investigation itself. The successful use of forensic genetic genealogy signaled a turning point. Cold cases once considered unsolvable were reopened across the country. Law enforcement agencies began re-examining archived evidence with new tools and methods. At the same time, public debate intensified over privacy, consent, and the boundaries of data use. The Golden State Killer case became both a triumph and a cautionary example. Joseph James DeAngelo will die in prison. He will never walk free again. Yet his capture did not erase the years he spent hidden in plain sight. He lived among neighbors who never suspected him. He attended family gatherings. He aged quietly. His crimes were not exposed by a slip of the tongue or a moment of panic, but by the steady advance of science. This case stands as a reminder that time does not protect those who commit violence. It delays accountability, but it does not cancel it. Evidence persists. Technology evolves. And even the most careful offender leaves something behind. The story of the Golden State Killer is not only about a man who terrorized a state. It is about the endurance of victims, the persistence of investigators, and the moment when decades of silence finally broke. Justice did not arrive quickly, but it arrived. And for one of the longest-running and most feared serial offenders in American history, time, at last, ran out.